from Massachusetts and also acknowledge her leadership on this issue. Ms. Pressley, your 5 minutes.
Thank you. I did want to also just thank Representative Sarbanes for his leadership and partnership on the issue of school-based health centers. There, but for the grace of God go I can say with certainty that it was a school nurse that saw the signs of trauma and abuse in my own life. And it is so important that the school community are trained in these indicators because, yes, there are children that act out, but there are many more that shut down, and I was one of those children. I do want to say, though, I've always taken issue with the term that children are resilient because I think it infers for people that they get over things. And the reality is that no child, no person is really that resilient. What we are is delayed. And these things do all show up in some way, form, or shape in our lives. It presents differently for everyone. And I think ultimately what we want to see in our school communities is a paradigm shift in culture where people will ask, what happened to you instead of what is wrong with you? And that is a distinctive shift that needs to occur. But it's also important to note that our children are not independent contractors. You know, they are part of a broader ecosystem of family and community. And the best gift that we can give any child is a stable adult. But most adults are also destabilized, right? And so when you talk about the issue of trauma and the stigma and the stereotyping and the one-dimensional narrative, I want to say when I first started talking about this issue in running for the Boston City Council, that people were worried that I was coddling children or that I was feeding a stereotype of who is impacted by trauma. And that's why the testimony of our witnesses earlier is so important in what you've offered here today, is that hardship and trauma do not discriminate. There are some disruptions and hardships that are disproportionately borne by others based on historical legacies and systems and structures, but it does not discriminate. And so bearing that in mind, this is a public health issue, an epidemic, and it must be treated as such, and we need to be not only coordinated, but equitable. There is no hierarchy of hurt, and I appreciate your pushing for us to address this in a comprehensive way. I convened the first hearing in the Boston City Council, a listening-only hearing to hear from 300+ families who are survivors of homicide victims, and that was where it was underscored for me that it's critical that this work be survivor-led. My district is coming off of the heels since July 3rd of 18 shootings. And so I recently convened and assembled civic leaders, faith leaders, survivors, advocates, family members of offenders to all come together. And so I request unanimous consent to enter into the record written testimony from the Office of Suffolk County District Attorney Rachael Rollins, the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, which has an incredible national model and blueprint for this work, Wellspring Mentors, Mass General Hospital, and residents and community leaders across the Massachusetts 7th. Picking up on that note of the need for us to be coordinated, there were medical professionals that were in this meeting, and they said that they've been trained to stitch up victims, and many of them were repeat victims. But it was only recently they thought to ask about who are they and what are the needs of those victims that were coming into their ER and they were stitching up. And why is it that they keep coming back, right? So I just wanted to lift up something from the Administration for Children and Families. It says African Americans experience generations of slavery, segregation, and institutionalized racism that has contributed to physical, psychological, and spiritual trauma. Dr. Shervington, when the root causes that often lead to trauma are so entrenched in our very infrastructure, discriminatory housing, policies, health and racial disparities, how do we respond?
I think, as you said, a real comprehensive approach. I tend to see these issues across the social ecological model. So as a physician, as a psychiatrist, at the individual level, when the harm is done, we need to fix that for the person. And I would just like to underscore what you said. How many times can you kick someone down and expect them to get back up? And usually it's in those systems and those structures. And so as public health practitioners or clinicians, we have to advocate for those kinds of policies that are going to look at those inequities and try to fix them. We can't do them alone. And so we have to be in partnership with those in our communities, and it has to be community-driven, how these inequities play out. We have to work with them. We're not isolated. So in our emergency room in New Orleans, the public emergency room, the trauma surgeons, they have built in some supports where at least they're screening for PTSD in the victims who are coming in, or I should say survivors. They're working with them, but they're also going into the community, working with community-based advocates who are really looking at these structural factors that help to perpetuate the poverty and the violence that can happen when communities are disconnected.
Thank you.
Thank you. Your time has expired, and Mr. Gibson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Gibbs, thank you.